Who is the biggest troll in history? I forget the name, but that one guy from the 1800s who bought specific tickets to a play and then gave them away to bald men on the street so that when everyone took their seats and the bald men's heads reflected the light from the stage, they spelled out "frick" a scene from the stage. Please tell me you have a source on this. This Chinese general whose city was besieged by a much larger army, so he opened the main gate and sat atop it playing his flute. The enemy thought it was a trap, so they packed their stuff and left. Zhuge Liang. Magnificent bastard was so feared as a strategist and tactician. He was allegedly carried onto the battlefield posthumously, and the opposing army, despite knowing he was already dead, decided they couldn't take the chance he had some sneaky crap in the works for them. Zhuge Liang, the type of dude to stuff his body full of nitroglycerine and wait for the enemy general to perform a celebratory punch to his explosive nuts. A true champion of Tsinch. Stephen Hawking was in an interview when a cord was unplugged and alarm went off. This was before he was completely immobile and he slumped in his chair. The people interviewing him were scared out of their minds until they realized that he was alright and chuckling at his joke. The cord and alarm were for a computer. Not to mention the meme about the multiverse where the interviewer asked if there was a world where he was smarter than Hawking. Hawking said yes, and one where you're funny. It was John Oliver's interview. That was a great episode. I posted this comment once on an Reddit about the best frick it, I'll do it myself moment in history, but I think the tale of the Agent Garbo, the double agent whose real name was Juan Pujol Garcia, applies here too. He trolled Hitler and the Nazi regime so hard it boggles the mind, and he didn't merely get away with it, he was given an Iron Cross by them. Okay, so it's time for me to talk about Juan Pujol Garcia. A hotel clerk and former unsuccessful chicken farmer was frustrated with the fascist government of Spain, and Germany's warmongering was getting scary. France had fallen, the USSR and USA were both neutral so far, and only Britain was left to stand against the Nazis. As he said years later, he believed he had to do something for the good of humanity, even though, by all accounts, he was a nobody, just a hotel clerk and failed chicken farmer who'd briefly served on both sides of the Spanish Civil War, leaving with a dislike of fascism and communism both. So Juan, naturally, decided to become a spy and mess over Hitler as hard as he could. Logical career move for a hotel clerk, I'm sure you'll agree. But the British, who he wanted to help, weren't interested. He'd asked to help at the embassy in Madrid several times. The Brits were all like, who are you? Actually never mind, we don't care, you can't do crap to help us, and we don't really trust you, so scram. Juan, of course, was undeterred. He decided that the Nazis had to be destroyed, and he figured it would be easier to do so from within. So he reinvents himself as a fanatically fascist government official and applies to help the Germans spy on the Brits, claiming he has a way to actually get undercover to Britain to spy on them. All of this is utter bullcrap, of course. The Germans say, sure, we could use the help and hire him. Since he can't get to Britain, he goes to Lisbon, Portugal, frequenting the library to learn about Britain, so he can convincingly just make crap up. He sends the German Navy on a wild goose chase for a non-existent naval convoy at the Mediterranean island of Malta. The Germans are convinced he's the best spy they have in Britain. After all, the rest of them keep getting captured, except for the ones Garcia is recruiting. Or, rather, inventing. His recruits were as real as a Maltese convoy, which is to say, not even a little real. They did make good fall guys to blame when his intel was off. The Brits meanwhile are looking for him, since the German codes they were breaking showed the Germans allegedly had a spy setting up a spy ring in Britain. But then they read his messages. Juan allegedly had a Scottish contact who would do anything for a liter of wine. That tipped the Brits off that someone was just messing with German intel. I mean, metric system, anyone. A Scotsman who drinks wine, unrealistic. So eventually the Lisbon British Embassy tipped off MI6 that this guy in Lisbon was trying to tell them he was literally a German intelligence agent and would like to help fight the Nazis, please. So they brought him to Britain and gave him the codename Agent Garbo. He teamed up with MI6 where he continued to bullcrap the Nazis with a combination of pure lies, true but useless intel, and useful intel that arrived just a bit too late to help the Germans at all. He convinced the Germans D-Day was a feint, not the main Allied invasion. That would come farther east at Calais. He convinced the Germans the 1st US Army Group led by General Patton would lead it. The 1st US Army Group was made of divisions that didn't exist, in an empty base, with inflated fake tanks and airplanes to convince German planes flying above Dover think it was legit. The Germans kept a large number of troops and tank divisions back at Calais to repel an invasion force which never landed. These troops could have stopped the Allied landings at Normandy. Instead they sat at Calais, doing nothing. The Germans gave Pujol the Iron Cross second class for his essential aid to the Nazi regime. The British government soon after made him a member of the Order of the British Empire. His German spy handler gave him his Iron Cross in person after the war, apologizing profusely for failing to win the war he'd helped them so much with. I imagine it was difficult to keep a straight face for that conversation. TLDR. Failed chicken farmer from Spain wages personal war of lies against Nazi Germany and wins. Marcel Duchamp, who, among other fun things, submitted a urinal as an art piece to the Society of Independent Artists under a pseudonym, and then was part of the board that was set to approve pieces. He also spread rumors of another piece he was working on so people wouldn't suspect anything. Love that dude. Plus he sparked an interesting discussion in art. He is also responsible for a painting titled LHOOQ. It was of the Mona Lisa sporting a mustache and a wee goatee. The letters in the title, when pronounced in French, sound very like she has a hot ass. Literally yes, though it's an expression that means she's horny. There was a Prussian, I can't remember his name, who managed to make her officer uniform out of scraps of clothing. He used it to convince a few guards on patrol to follow him into a government building, ordered the arrest of the man in charge, confiscated all the money personally, sent the arrested man to Berlin calming it was all on order of the king. He then ditched the uniformed, got on a train to Berlin and managed to beat the guards there. He then sat back and watched the absolute confusion happen. The guy was eventually arrested, but the public turned him into a celebrity and his actions into a play that was performed all over Germany. He wasn't incarcerated for long, and after his release he lived an easy life from there on. He's called the Hauptmann von Kopernik. Snitch. Those guys that rode Kilroy was here during WW2. So a ton of US and British soldiers? They wrote that to tell other Allied soldiers that were advancing behind them that hey, we beat you to it. Our unit was first. Kind of thing. Pretty much that. It caused both Hitler and Stalin to look into who Kilroy was. It was inspired by the Aussie WW1 graffiti known as For Was Here, although that wasn't nearly as well known. The old-timey New York City newspaper The Sun Imo. In the 19th century, they published some articles about the presence of life on the moon like unicorns, winged humans, and other creatures who built temples and lived peacefully. This caused a massive moon craze, until it was later outed as fake. The most popular tabloid newspaper in the UK is called The Sun and it's famous for being a perpetual geyser of complete bollocks. If hell has a department for ironic punishments, I imagine Rupert Murdoch will be punished by actually having to read every article published in The Sun. I wouldn't even wipe my bottom with the UK Sun, it's completely terrible and a waste of words. Also, I hope Rupert Murdoch has some actually crappy punishment in hell. Frick that guy. The annoying part is that some idiots actually read The Sun and believe all their bullcrap. Leonardo da Vinci. He made almost no actual contributions to science. Everything he discovered and documented in his journals could not be read as they were encoded and mirrored. Much of what he discovered had been rediscovered by the time the books were decoded. Not trolling, just gave no fricks. Painted the people he wanted to paint, stopped painting when he got bored. His main day job was being in charge of putting up awesome elaborate decorations and moving set pieces for plays, pageants, and holidays. Most of his work doesn't survive. Guy was a legit intuitive genius. He advanced the state of the art at the time in over a dozen fields. Never published anything. He mostly just took the time to actually look and investigate for himself, rather than merely seek out the existing knowledge in books. He figured out how the aorta works by dissecting bodies and doing experiments with flowing water. He developed his famous Sumato style of using blurred rather than sharp lines because he observed that vision works that way. Everyone else had just assumed we see edges as sharp lines. Go look at the edge of a table, say, no matter how close you get you'll see a slightly fuzzy edge. It's these type of simple, profound observations and the meandering curiosity to follow them wherever they led which made him special. Him being one of Niccolo Machiavelli's friends makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? This will be buried, but Sergei Korolev, the dude was getting frustrated with the Soviet government because they weren't interested in funding his space exploration projects, so he got his propaganda group to publish articles about how Russia was getting close to sending something into space. As expected, the US took the bait and started working on their satellite program, and the Soviet government freaked out when they saw the US doing that, so they funded Korolev's projects. He and his group played them good. LMAO, dude's a legend. He probably cold-gotten the Soviets to the moon first. He was sent by Stalin to a gig in the 30s that really fricked up his health. He died in 1966, I believe. Pope John XII. He was pope during his teenage and late 20s, so naturally we all know that he was kind of an ass. But he was not only an ass, but literally the biggest ass of not caring. He would do wine and sexual debauchery, and literally did not care about anything that went happened. He was the ruler of papal states until he died. But yeah, John XII was not a good pope. If anything, he was the worst pope in the century, but he was literally the physical embodiment of rich and powerful connections. Also Amadeus Mozart, guy literally did not also give a frick. Wrote one of the famous pieces of his time about literal crap. One of his pieces was also called Lick Me in the Ass. Just FYI. Giles Corey, a farmer caught up in the Salem witch trials. He was sentenced to pressing, being slowly crushed by stones, to force him to make a plea. Every time he was questioned, he simply said more weight. He died without making a plea. If he pled innocent, they would have convicted him anyway and taken his property from his family. If he pled guilty, they would have convicted him and taken his property from his family. If you don't enter a plea, the court at the time could not exercise jurisdiction over you. That's why courts occasionally tortured people into making a plea. Since he didn't enter a plea, the court couldn't take all his crap. William Horace Devere Cole. He fooled the British Navy with one of his pranks. The Dreadnought hoax. Virginia Woolf and her brother were involved with that. A bunch of friends dressed in blackface and fake ethnic clothing, pretending to be foreign royalty, and got a tour of the HMS Dreadnought. One acted as a translator, while the others talked nonsense to each other, and would often excitedly point to something, shout bunga bunga. He is also probably the first documented case of the roadwork prank. He put down fake and contradictory construction signs and tied up London traffic for hours. Don't know if this has been said, but Stalin. He convicted his closest friends of treason, then had them sentenced to death. Later on, they were blindfolded and awaiting the firing squad's bullets. The squad fired blanks. Stalin pulled the blindfolds off and said, "Gotcha." Legend. Ewan Pugil Garsha. A man in WWI who decided to be a counterintelligence agent against the Nazis. Britain and US rejected his offer, so he did it on his own. Made up an alias as a pro-Nazi Spaniard. Made up a ton of fake agents that the Nazis paid him for. Sent Nazis hunting a bunch of bogus convoys and boats for years. And eventually trolled the Nazi regime so hard he was recruited by the Allied intelligence.